Welcome everybody to the Critical Antiquities workshop. We're delighted to have Professor Mario Telò with us today. Before we go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the universities of Sydney and Wollongong meet and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to just spend a moment reflecting on the speaker that we have by introducing him and trying to capture the wonderful range and depth of his work. So we of course have Professor Mario Telò from the University of California, Berkeley, where he is, I believe, Professor of Classics, but kind of spread across a range of departments. And I know what that feels like. As a political theorist in Australia, I can relate. I also have been spread across many different departments in my very short career. But Mario is in the Classics Department of Rhetoric, Classics and Comparative Literature, I believe. Is that right, Mario?
Yeah, so there are three distinct departments. Yes, so I'm
There you go.
50, 25, and 25, sparagmatically disseminated. Yeah.
There you go. So he's been in the United States since 2008 or so, I believe. Before that, he did his training in Italy. He did his undergraduate at the Università degli Studi di Pisa and his PhD and Masters in Classics at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. And he's been at UCLA and then at Berkeley since 2016 as professor of classics. And his work is impressive, to say the least. His first book, which I believe comes out of his PhD thesis, is on Eupolis's Demes. Is that what it's called? Or that's what it is, isn't it?
Eupolis Demi.
Demi, thank you. But since then has gone on to publish a really impressive range of works, which bring together classics and contemporary theory and contemporary, and modern literature in wonderful ways. So just to give a little bit of a snapshot of that work, he has published in 2016 a monograph, Aristophanes and the Cloak of Comedy, Affect, Aesthetics and the Canon with the University of Chicago Press. In 2020, he published Archive Feelings, A Theory of Greek Tragedy with Ohio State University Press. And then he has a scintillating list of forthcoming works, which I'm really excited to see. So with Punctum Books in an exciting new series, which is, I believe, co-edited by Sean Gerd, whose own work is noteworthy and very interesting. He has a book called Resistant Form, Aristophanes and the Comedy of Crisis, with Bloomsbury. He has a book entitled Greek Tragedy in a Global Crisis, Reading Through Pandemic Times. And under contract with Bloomsbury, he has a book entitled Judith Butler and the Ethics of Greek Tragedy. So this is all very apropos of the work of Critical Antiquities, and so we're delighted to finally have him at the workshop. And today he's going to be speaking to us on, and let me pull up the title so I don't completely fudge it. The title is, I've lost it. Where is it? Mario, can you tell us the title? I'm
Sure,
sorry.
it's called, let me remember. Yes, it's Geopower, Blackness and the Pandemic, Reading Antigone with Arman and Du Bois.
That's the one. Thank you very much.
Good.
And please, everyone, join me in welcoming Mario and thanking him for this presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, Tristan. That was so generous. You are so nice. I wish I could hug you just to show you how much I appreciated that introduction. Maybe another time. Okay, let's see whether I can share my screen and okay, play from start. Can you all see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, so a Greek tragedy might help us capture the contradictory sensations engendered by the pandemic. On the one hand, there is the frightening yet liberating feeling of the imminent end of the world, an imminence, however, laden with the chronic exhaustion of ongoing non-eventality. On the other hand, there is the realization that nothing has changed, that the systemic inequalities structuring the world as we know it have been heightened. The tension between a radically disruptive imminence, whether annihilation or quasi-utopian reinvention of the social, and the suffocating permanence, a preservation of the status quo, appears fundamentally tragic in the sense of that which can never be resolved. Rather than helping us get through the pandemic, a phrase used in a 2020 New Yorker headline that presents the current crisis as a parenthesis before the reinstatement of normalcy, pre-tragedy might lead us to acknowledge that there is no return or aftermath. What we are left with in the widely assumed after of the pandemic is the particular chronicity of the crisis, no longer a state of emergency with a perceptible end point, but an endless dilation and the longing for an irretrievably lost status quo. If great tragedy can help us cope with the pandemic, it may do so by pushing against our disavowal of the loss and our yearning for restoration, a yearning that might contribute to reinscribing rather than dismantling systemic structures of inequality. This afternoon or this morning, I want to explore some of these theoretical issues by rereading Antigone as an image of our never fully post-pandemic predicaments, of the lingering sense of the imminence of the world, of the imminence of the end, which encompasses climate change and war. In particular, I will seek to offer a picture of Antigone as the Phanonian wretched of the earth, or the wretched earth, as a figuration of that which is extracted in a geological and racial sense, but also an embodiment of geopower. In a study published in the journal Nature in the first year of the pandemic, we read that the lockdown might, at least momentarily, have done some good to the Earth. The planet is moving a little less, the researchers say, commenting on a drop in seismic noise, the hum of vibrations in the planet's crust, which could be the result of transport networks and other human activities being shut down. This change, they added, could allow detectors to spot smaller earthquakes and boost efforts to monitor volcanic activity and other seismic events. Though the pandemic might have enhanced consciousness of the entanglement of the now of human history with the long now of geological and biological timescales, the narcissistic and complacent desire for normalcy has meant an eager resumption of the extractivist dynamics to which the COVID crisis may be imputed. Dynamics that, if allowed to continue, will complete the sixth great extinction in the non-too-distant future. As observed by Claire Colebrook, the concept of the Anthropocene as the intrusion of geological forces into the experience of being human was only possible because some humans, enslaved people, were regarded as energy to be extracted, torn from the ground of existence, and rendered into nothing more than matter for the sake of human progress. What's conventionally called geology, the epistemological scientific ally of technologies of subjugation of Gaia, cannot be divorced from the bio and necropolitical divisions between human and non-human, life and non-life, that underpin ongoing practices of neocolonial racialization. Reading Sophocles' Antigone in these not yet post-pandemic or pan-endemic times may alert us to the play's resonance with and even possible participation in debates on the current condition of Gaia and our own approaches, epistemological, political, and affective, to it. Crayon's view of the cave where Antigone will die as a prison, a stage for his punitive reduction of her to a corpse, denies symbolic agency not just to the underworld's inhabitants, but also to the earth as such, the world upon which we live, itself a living organism endowed with a circulation, a respiration, and a nervous system of its own, as Arthur Conan Doyle put it, echoing a well-established idea in indigenous cultures. Crayon's act can be called terroristic, to borrow a pun used by Salar Mameni to conceptualize the terroristic wars on the earth, terra, that neocolonialisms never cease waging. The notion of living, breathing land contests the instrumentalization of the earth, the taken for granted setting of human life, and in this case, Crayon's geontological distinction between life, that which is above the earth, and non-life, that which is below it. The image of Polynices lying unburied on the ground offers an opportunity to shift the notion of Gaia from mere setting to support, the surface without which we cannot move or even breathe. Judith Butler has observed that when environments start to fall apart or are emphatically unsupportive, we are left to fall, and our very capacity to exercise most basic rights is imperiled. As I approach Antigone in this global crisis, I'm drawn to reading into Antigone's funerary reparation for her brother an attachment to Gaia as the supporting surface, or her own becoming ground or Gaia, both as instrumentalized base and basic environmental support. In my re-engagement with the play, I thus want to heed Antigone's attraction to and her own embodiment of geopower. In the words of Elizabeth Gross, while biopower is the power over life that regulates it from outside, geopower has no outside, no place or time before or beyond it. It is the force of the earth itself which we have tried to render consistent and predictable, but which we can never fully master, since the earth remains the literal ground and condition for every human and non-human action. Geopower is entangled with what Lara Langer Cohen calls the subterraneization of blackness. This is the term that she uses to explore the underground as a racist and racialized space, the symbolic as well as physical relegation of Black people to the depths of the earth, in a dark abyss that engulfs them as both an extracting and extracted instrument of colonialist capitalisms. In his appeal to the colored citizens of the world, 1829, David Walker speaks, quote, of the very dark and the most impenetrable abyss in which our fathers for many centuries have been plunged, end quote. Yet, subterraneization of blackness also implicates an ever-present, ever-imminent underground threat to extractivist racialization, evoking Sylvia Wynter's idea of underlife, Saidiya Harman's assimilation of slavery to the underground of discourse, Fred Moten's Fanonian characterization of blackness as ontologies underground, Stefano Harney and Moten's undercommons, and Fanon's own notion of insurrectionary non-being as a descent into a real hell where authentic upheaval can be born, an image also akin to Frederick Douglass's slumbering yet rebellious volcano. In reconsidering Antigone through geopower and its connection with the underlife of blackness, I'm inspired by the intertwinement, formal, affective, aesthetico-political, that, as I argue, Antigone imaginatively brings about between two pandemic texts. W.E.B. Du Bois's 1920 novella, The Comet, and Saidiya Harman's 2022 Litany for Grieving Sisters, written with bits from or references to Sophocles' play and Butler's Antigone's Claim. In Harman's Antigonian experiment, an Antigone of the Black Mourning, Mourning, roams through a city in ruins, clutching a child she could not save from death, in search of a brother who might no longer be alive. Walking in a deserted Harlem, Harman's Antigone, who, as Harman says, is not the last sister on earth, though this is how it feels, brings to mind Jim, the protagonist of Du Bois's The Comet, published in the same year as Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in the wake of the great influenza pandemic that killed Freud's daughter, Sophie. In the United States, this pandemic, like COVID, disproportionately hit African Americans, whose deaths were underreported. In this short story, Jim's return upward to above ground New York City after a descent underground at the bank where he works results in the discovery that the world has come to an end, but is the only surviving human. Commenting in the early days of COVID on this work of speculative fiction isolated in Du Bois's corpus, Harman draws attention to the epiphany of a surviving female figure, perhaps Jim's lover, partner, wife, or sister, at the end of the story. As she puts it, paraphrasing Du Bois, a brown, small, and toil-worn woman makes her way through the crowd with the corpse of a dark baby in her arms. This character, I wish to speculate, is none other than the Antigone in Harman's Litany for Grieving Sisters. At the end of the world, in a situation of desolate solitude, the atmosphere of the lockdown, the black man and the earth, targets of extractivist predation, feel liberated from the world and thus alive for the first time. In Du Bois's The Comet and Sophocles' Antigone, Jim's and Antigone's departure from an above-ground existence to embrace the earth rather than excavating it has a contagious effect. The survivors, Jim and Crayon, return upward to find themselves alone, forced to live in a desolate world. In a move of abolitionist ecology, the world, in Du Bois's story and in Sophocles' play, is dismantled or destroyed to be built anew. In Harman's Litany for Grieving Sisters, which is imbued with the speculative atmosphere of The Comet, I'm struck by the paratactical description of Antigone in the finale. The no longer mother, the not wife, the kinless sister, the lost daughter, the not woman, the not man, the nobody, the cipher, the matrix, she's still here. The persistence of the matrix suggests an assimilation of Antigone to the primary matrix that is Gaia, or geopower, and as the ongoingness of a syndeton intimates, the abyss of deep geological time. This persistence is shared by the buildings that witness Antigone's desolate walk, supporting infrastructure surrounding her, foundations and enclosures, in her words, untouched, indifferent, and solid, as if waiting for new occupants, which allow us to see her as the ground, a platform of stillness, the ecological matrix of care, subjected yet resistant to extraction, the surface pressed upon or put upon by human life. In Armand's litany, we read that care will swallow her whole, steal her last breath, crush and destroy her. Even though she's above ground, her unconditional investment in care implies a kind of gravitational pull, not just toward, but below the earth. The selflessness of care, the self-mutilation of self-killing it entails, is almost literalized as a fall, once again, into an underground real, into a subterranean undercommons. But I want to reverse the image and think about this movement as a stretching upward of underlife into the world of the living. As Alenka Zupancic observes in her brand new book on Antigone, which is Lacanian, but also in some respects post-Lacanian, to be able to say death, that is, to bring it into language, you have to bring death to life. You have to make it part of life, give it a symbolic existence to which you can relate. You have to resurrect death from death, so to speak. One has the sense that Armand's Antigone, precisely like the protagonist of Du Bois' story, comes directly from the world of the dead and brings this world upward. She embodies a seismic underontology, a force of non-being that breaks up the solidity of the ground, shattering the illusion of Gaia's acquiescence to the tread of the human foot. I now want to turn to Sophocles' Antigone. My first impression of Antigone's entanglement with geopower comes from rereading the initial scene, the sororal debate on the forbidden burial of Polynices, which has acquired new resonance in light of the forbidden funerals of the early pandemic. In these and the following readings, my hyperformalistic attention to the Greek text is meant to generate wayward suggestions, pointing to unexpected critical theoretical possibilities and a metapolitical critique that, as I see it, inheres in the impressions of tragic feeling mobilized by microform. In this scene, an interlinear echo seems to connect the sisters even at this tense juncture of the sibling conflict through the proximity of two principles, both material and immaterial, both personal and impersonal, earth, zonos, and time, chronos, which both occur on the edge, at the end of their respective lines. In the context of a durational, expansive chronos beyond symbolic time, a time beyond your life, or beyond human life as such, Antigone brings together formally confusing vairness, a K, and recumbency, Kaisomai, her own recumbency matching her brother's. In the same line, the elsewhere of the underworld and the kind of horizontality of being are confounded, as though the eternity of subterranean life, of time beyond time, were materialized in a prolonged cadence, K, A, K, A, K, figuring the collapse of human vertical ontology, the emergence of a subterranean vitality, a persistent, insurgent life-death in death. Lying there for Antigone does not mean simply residing or reposing within the earth together with her brother, but becoming earth-like, or the earth itself, embracing and inhabiting the horizontality of the ground, enacting a refusal of standing, a phrase of Stefano Arni and Motens that I will return to at the end. Antigone's chthonic chronos is thus a prospective embodiment of Ismene's xonos. When later on Creon asks Antigone, you who are bowing your head toward the ground, are you admitting it, or do you deny having done it? Bearing her brother, her orientation toward the ground, toward Xon, coincides with the undifferentiated deep time of silence, chronos. Midway through the passage, I will lie, kaisomai, situated in the center, mediates, as it were, between the two overlapping phrases, dear I to him, and with him, with the one who is dear to me, charting for Antigone a transition from familial possession to self-dispossession. The referent of the feminine adjective phile, she disappears in the masculine adjective philou. Yet, rather than a disappearance of the female subject phile or an incorporation into the masculine grammatical realm, philou, this syntactical transition suggests a non-hierarchical joining with the other, as indicated by the reciprocal elision of personal pronouns, first of to him and then to me. This joining, a juxtaposition of horizontalities, is like contact with the ground, earth as a supporting structure. It is the coming together of two animate and inanimate horizontalities, togetherness in an encounter of surfaces. To continue this line of thought, I will dwell on the words of the guard when he reports to Creon that someone has buried Polynices, implicitly, unwillingly emphasizing a notion of onness, a desire, as I see it, to rest one's body on another. I'll tell you, someone just now departed after having buried the corpse of Polynices, sprinkling on its skin, a P, thirsty dust, and putting on, a P, all the rites that are necessary. The guilty action is encapsulated by the preposition that expresses the sprinkling of dust in the feminine gender on the body of Polynices. We can say that the ep on, occurring in the same metrical position in two consecutive lines, becomes the ground for identifying the mysterious agent with a subject manifesting itself and its feminine gender as granular matter poured on a body. the metonymic substance of the ground, which is the support for and of all, the surface that both presses and is pressed upon. In his account of the legal burial, the guard reiterates the image of a thin layer of dust, lepte conis, placed on the body of the enemy Polynices, locating the two elements of this phrase at the opposite edges of the line, crafting an iconic effect of both distance and closeness. Divided in two, like brother and sister, the feminine dust supports the textual middle, which suggests Polynices' own onness, his corpse reposing on a p, the layer of dust, the ground offered by Antigone. Antigone's kinship with geopower, her onness, is also relevant to the guard's descriptive dwelling on the earth's recalcitrance, on its hard refusal to reveal the identity of the wrongdoer. The sexualized language of this passage calls forth the virgin Antigone, tying a bond between her name, the one who is against birth, in which the prefix anti equals an alpha privative, and the adjective arrox, unbroken or unbreakable, which brings out the resistant force of the ground. Later, accompanying Antigone to the cave, the chorus observes that she is descending to the underworld without having been violated by a sword or struck by destructive diseases. That is, she is untouched by vehicles of harm, just as at the site of Polynices' furtive burial rite, the ground remains untouched by any groundbreaking tool or vehicle. Beyond the negative prefix, the Antigonian ground's resistance is expressively conveyed by the sound of brokenness, or of that which would break it, in arrox and the nearby trochoisin wheels, a sound that phonesthetically recalls the English word rock in its double connotation of hardness and shaking. The characterization of ge as a hard surface appears strikingly Antigonian if we read it in light of Creon's later rebuke of her. Know that two hard temperaments are the ones that mostly fall, and that the strongest iron, baked by fire so as to become hard, is the one that you would see is most frequently broken and shattered. We could say that similarly, the dust which Creon's men sweep away as they drag Antigone off stage remains an agent of geopower, the matter of the supporting ground, the constituent of the dry surface of the earth. Additionally, the adjective stuflos, hard, makes the earth Antigonian by containing and sibilantly supplementing tuflos, blind, an adjective that unmistakably identifies Oedipus. It is the second word of Oedipus and Colonus. The morphologically transgender phrase stuflos ge, a mismatch of feminine and masculine endings, assimilates the ground, the environmental support figured by Antigone, to the bodily and familial assemblage of father and daughter that is the affective and dramaturgical symbol of Oedipus and Colonus, a play postdating this one but preceding it in mythical time. In that play, Antigone isn't just a surrogate foot, a prosthesis, but also the human support who doubles the maternal ground of Colonus by offering Oedipus a rest, by seating, positioning, and stationing him. In the guard's account of the environmental turmoil that followed the removal of Antigone's dust from Polynices, an atmospheric rage shakes up textual form, precipitating the epiphany of the enjambed juxtaposition ktonos typhos, a typhoon from or of the earth, which seems to recreate the subliminal image of Antigone as Oedipal earth. The paragrammatic attraction of the earth and the typhoon, confounding cause and effect, earth and its liquid aerial manifestation, invites us to see the atmospheric protest against the violence of the law as a manifestation of geopower realized in a striking alliteration. In the last line, the plane, pedion, the ostensible object, appears to fill the line with pies, a labial accretion that enacts the expansiveness of geopower, as though the earth were overstepping elemental boundaries, filling the atmosphere or time itself with traces or layers of itself, transferring the subterranean sameness of deep time upward and outward into the air. According to Ted Toadvine, the abyssal character of deep time, whether the prehistorical span of the geological or the Earth's far future, is our experience of its anachronous interruption of lived temporality from within. In this line, we can read a dramatization of what Catherine Yusoff has called the immersion of humanity into geological time, or the geologization, we might say, the remineralization of anthropos, which implies a shift in the human timescale from biological life course to that of epoch and species life. The protesting geopower materialized in the guard's account proclaims that being is always tied into being toward the geologic, conceptually, ontologically, and materially, but it may threaten something more ominous, a burial and destruction of the upper world, as we may infer from the eco-critical implications of the choral announcement or prophecy that, quote, the bloody dust of the underworld is bearing the house of Oedipus again. A different yet related aspect of geopower in Antigone is the impression that reconnecting physically with family members in the underworld entails an intimate encounter with mineral sensuality, a contact with rocky subterranean surfaces as animated dwellings or embodiments of lost loved ones, geological subjects. I wish to read in Antigone's speech before she's taken off stage into her prison cave an expressive emergence of prospective and projective geosocialities that disrupts the divide between human and non-human objects of catexis and haptic bonding. This speech is organized around tripartite over-determinacies, as indicated and most programmatically by Antigone's triple address to the cave, her forever guarded home. The Ur-triad is, however, the familial one of father, mother, and brother, all of whom receive the adjective philos, a marker of affective self-projection, a self-dispossessive fantasy of intimate possession. This demand for closeness and tactile rejoining, which is implicit in the repetition of the possessive adjective philos, is complicated in the last part of the speech by the reference to the hands of Creon's guards, to their participation in an assault or an act of physical appropriation, which engenders another triad, a series of negative expressions channeling Antigone's devotion to the possession of loss, with no bed, with no husband, and having no part. In using negative adjectives that amount to reflections of her name, Antigone is reclaiming the dispossession foisted upon her by hostile hands, seizing it from the state's biopolitical grip. Semantically reconfigured, co-opted into her own sphere of being, the punitive touch is shadowed by the ghostly feel of the desired reunion with her father, her mother, and the brother who is invoked just before Antigone deictically directs attention to Creon's violence. The formal proximity between "Oh brother" and "now he, Creon, drags me," where the subject of the verb is left indefinite, facilitates imaginative proximities between tactile sensations, wanted and unwanted, tender and aggressive, ontologically past and future, and intrusively present. By the same logic of projective and prospective confusion of sensations, we can say that the initial triad, or grave or bridal chamber of subterranean abode, overlays geology onto the biology of father, mother, and brother, and thus inorganic onto organic, non-human rocky flesh onto human flesh. Harking back to Creon's instruction to his guards, enclose her in the grave that is covered over and then leave her alone, Antigone's words, "covering your body, brother," invite us to see an embracing, intimate bond between her and the rock. What I'm suggesting is that we cannot interpretively sever Antigone's longed-for reattachments, the intensity of her prospective reconnections with her Philoe, from an exposure to geological sensuality. We could conceive of this sensuality as a non-extractivist experience of lithic closeness and affection. Embracing Polynices again means dwelling on and in an intimate affinity with the structure of the cave, which indigenous studies have taught us to think of as an earth being. It means playing with the texture of craggy surfaces as a way to access stratified time, to sample through impressions of the rock's formation the rough edges of past familial dramas, even to find and caress the bodies of the dead in stony shapes, in the fortuitous drawings traced by erosion, in silhouettes and profiles, broken lines and contours that the mind is affectively drawn to, tricked into recognizing as familiar in the natural sculptures of the subterranean landscape. In her newly published book, Going Underground, Lara Langer Cohen, whom I've previously referred to, analyzes Kentucky's Mammoth Cave, which in the 1830s became a major tourist destination as the longest known cave, after a brief period as an extractive site where slaves mined saltpeter and gypsum. In the cave's early tourist days, it was slaves, descendants of the miners, who acted as guides for the many visitors. Cohen observes that the impenetrability of the cave evokes the maroon communities scattered throughout the Americas, where fugitives from slavery built autonomous societies within the borders of state authority, but out of its view, most famously the Great Dismal Swamp, closely associated with Nat Turner's rebellion. A visitor to the cave in 1864, J.F. Rasling, reported that he had offered immediate freedom to Matterson Bransford, a chief tour guide, but that Bransford had declined, explaining that the cave seemed almost, quote, like a child now, end quote, adding, "We have been together so long." As Cohen comments, Bransford would have had many reasons to decline a white stranger's offer of freedom, but maybe he did call the cave kin. Three of his 4 children were sold away from him. Would this have made him more likely to find a child in the non-human world? I would add the following question. Could Bransford's stance be seen as an Antigonian formation of geosociality, an experiment in underground kinship, or as Tyler Bradway and Elizabeth Freeman would say, kinesthetics? Is such geological kinship, Bransford's and Antigone's, an expression of Sylvia Wynter's underlife, the site of the unfolding of nascent modes of sociality, as Nigel Cunningham observes? Another white visitor of Mammoth Cave, whose account is analyzed by Cohen, describes his terror inside the cave, whose labyrinthine passages patently figure blackness and, more specifically, the dark threat of solidarities between the human and non-human underground, and of alternative utopian and dystopian configurations of the social. At the end of Sophocles' play, the messenger's account of his journey with Creon, who has had second thoughts, to the subterranean prison where Antigone and her betrothed Haemon, Creon's son, have already taken their lives, seems to delineate a movement not toward but within the cave. The abundance of rough compounds, of groups of hard consonants, conveys an encounter with the pointed surfaces of the cave. It reflects uncertain movements through narrow karstic passageways, contorted tours of labyrinthine corridors and chasms, contact with agglomerates, with geological asperities, threatening yet alluring products of geopower. In the description of Antigone's bridal chamber, the compound Lithostroton, stone-floored, bumps up against the phonetics of Kore, the word that defines her virginity, conjuring the intimate contact of human flesh with a rocky surface, as well as the discomfiting allure of deep time's materiality at the end of times. In the messenger's speech, the concentration of long compounds suggests a sprawling, hard horizontality, an Antigonian refusal of standing, which places her in a transmaterial relation of affinity or identification with Gaia as the ground. Similar effects can be discovered in the phonesthetics of the descent of Du Bois's protagonist in The Comet, who approaches the underground as at once a place of exile and a regained home. The contracted passages of air produced in descriptive terms, mimicking arduous bodily motions in the underground labyrinth, conflate pandemics, slavery, mining, and the self-suffocations of the middle passage, multiple sides, aerosides, Aeroside, eroside, ecocide, and genocide, as though bringing a wounding power outward or upward in the very process of reading, the insurrectionary interruptive force of black underlife is diffused by the stumbling of the voice, the breaking up of breath in the midst of contorted velar, rhotic, and fricative accretions, crashing consonants, insistent hissing. The verbal roughening of the descriptive surface provokes mental exertion, a thickening of articulatory hair, like the broken breathing brought on by the comet that brings the world to an end, spreading a sickening stench, filling the nostrils with exhalations that, though delivered by an extraterrestrial object, figure the self-destructive consequences of colonization. When we read that great dark coils of wire came up from the earth, we imagine a spiraling upward, the anarchic ascent of a looping underground atmosphere reflected in the coiling and recoiling of sounds. The descent into the underworld and the underworld's ascent to the surface unfold as a break or in the break. Underground insurrection bursts out. The ground's solidity breaks, withdrawing its support. The rebellious impetus of depleted geopower is inseparable from the eruption of blackness through the subliminal intensity of surging form, notwithstanding the protagonist's persistent guilt, an internalized law that survives in his consciousness even after the white world has been decimated or has decimated itself. The return of Harman's Antigone to the world of the living is marked by the impression of her continuing residence in an underground labyrinth. It is not clear where Harman's Antigone is walking, but there are signals that she may be in a space that blends lower and upper realms. The labyrinth of the underworld has broken through the earth's surface. The world resembles a graveyard, a landscape of extinction. The apparent linearity of her gait, one step forward, then the next, runs up against the closed circularity of time, which can no longer be measured. In this disappearance of a temporal distribution of the sensible, the step which takes the ground for granted as a measurable surface, as the support that gets ground down in the act of counting, turns uncounted or uncountable. The step as the measuring measure is trapped in the loop of past future and future past, an underground acrony, the interruptive acrony of the pandemic. Antigone's blind path, in line with Oedipus's blindness, breaks open the possibility of an extinction of the subject/object opposition presupposed by the logic of sight, by the above ground light that makes blackness invisible. This Antigone is a Eurydice on a search, like Orpheus, a Eurydice bringing the underworld, a realm she refuses to abandon, upward with her. The description of Harman's Antigone assimilates her to the earth. This is an Antigone who bears on her body the wounding weight of successive centuries, who like a tree is marked by the pressure of generations, the dead weight of the world that is the human world. The marks on the earth's surface are the signs left by countless feet that have silently ground her, exhausting her. It is as though by becoming Antigone, the earth exits itself, treads on itself, reappropriating itself through self-dispossession. In this speculative fantasia, the earth, like the underground that it brings upward, cannot be separated from blackness itself, with its undocumented extinctions, such as the unreported deaths of the 1918 pandemic, its wounds subject to suppression and disavowal. The finale of Sophocles' Antigone brings us back to the pandemic extinction of Du Bois's The Comet by presenting Creon as the sole survivor of a disaster that he has brought upon himself. In Du Bois's story, the death of the world, the extinction provoked by the poisonous effluvia released into the atmosphere by the comet, creates an opening, Harman says, that might allow Jim to breathe inside his skin and be released from the enclosure of nothing. Similarly, it might rescue beneath the earth darkness, the geological counterpart of blackness, from the position of abused support, instrumentalized non-being. In Antigone, the sense of almost apocalyptic solitude that crushes Creon results in an atmosphere of telluric requital. Holding the body of his son, a horizontal burden, in his arms, he becomes human ground, an encumbered or broken base, like the earthly support that opens itself into the cave. When he says, "The god struck me with a great weight," we perceive his earthward precipitation, perhaps into the bowels of the earth. In the same lines, when we read "he," the god, shook Aces and me, we perceive a seismic movement, the quintessential expression of geopower. In accusing the god of trampling on his happiness, of treading on it like the ground below, Creon feels reduced to something like the underground he has disdained. His solitude, visualized by his moving between and around the corpses of his son and wife, resembles the outcome of an ecological disaster, the revolt of the extracted earth, which is also the source of the aerial pollution diffused by Du Bois's comet. As he laments the cumulative effect of one death, Aemon, piled upon another, his wife, one corpse beside or upon the other, while Antigone's body significantly remains below in the cave, he describes himself as pressed upon, the object of an oppressive onness marked by the prefix ep. Hades, you did me in, ep again, already a dead man, and the bloody death piled upon ep death. In facing the two bodies, he appears to grope for missing ground, for lost material support, for the base that he has broken and lost while serving as ground in spite of himself. As he says, I don't know which one to look toward, where to lean. The tone of the comet and the collection it belongs to oscillates between rage and despair, as Harman writes, adding, some might even describe it as an urtext of Afro-pessimism, but its mood is more tragic. Its bright moments are colored by a desire for a messianic cessation of the given, stoked by a vision of the end of the world, welcoming the gift of chance and accident. What Harman says of white supremacy, quote, its stranglehold appears so unconquerable, so eternal, that its only certain defeat is the end of the world, the death of man, end quote, can be extended to our trampling literally and metaphorically on the earth, to our reliance on technologies of geological extraction, always enmeshed with racism and racializing logics. Human life, as we know it, when qualified as human, always implicates dehumanization. In Antigone, the unburied corpse of Polynices and later of Antigone figures not only a denied burial, but a refusal of burial, as a practice that enacts the power of the state by establishing clear boundaries of life and death. It can be read as a refusal, in Jim Martle's words, to fold death back into ordinary life, to make death bearable and understandable, which is what funerals and other forms of ritual regulation of corpses, rites forbidden, shut down during the lockdown, purport to do. According or denying, as we have seen during the pandemic, the right of burial is ultimately a manifestation of the state's biopolitical power, its alleged capacity for discerning what is possible and what is not, what ought or ought not to be done, who is entitled to a right and who is not. I suggest that as we read Sophocles' play today, we shift our critical attention from the corpse to the cave as a locus of intimate contact with the most literal foundation of life itself, human and human, which is in itself non-foundational, developing minoritarian forms of affective relationality with the inside of the earth, rather than merely dwelling on or extracting from it. The disavowed or suppressed life of the underground that protects us from extinction, insofar as we leave it as and where it is, can be a site for recovering and reimagining through the pre- or post-human world of deep time the very possibility of a world while we face the ever-imminent collapse of this one. Looking at the cave, one of the symbols of Antigone during the pandemic, may perhaps enable us to view emergency as emergence. In his treatment of the Popol Vuh, the Quiché Mayan story of creation, Edgar Garcia observes that cave beings emerge from another side of time in the earth's depths, hidden from the casual disappearances and erasures of history. They could eat you up, he says, transport you to another world, take you to the moment of creation, but they are also involved with the historical matters of the world above. They break the world open to close it again in chthonic cycles. When at the end of the play, the body of Aemon, metonymus of Polynices and Antigone's unseen dead bodies, is brought on stage, followed by his mother's, the cave or the very inside of the earth tantalizingly emerges. What the cave carries politically is the scenario of a queer ecology, which Catherine Yusoff sees as one where subjects emerge as a constellation between inhuman time, non-human force, and geologic materialities. I see this ecology as grounded in a horizontality encapsulated by the fallenness of the corpse, an image of extinction and devastation, but also of the possibility of reorientation of relationality, spatial, familial, political, ecological, that consists in the juxtaposition, the adjacency of equally supporting entities, of mutually sustaining earth-like structures, human and non-human, microterras, as it were, instead of anthropoi. In Du Bois's Fantasia of Pandemic Destruction, the final image of a dead baby in the arms of the woman who will become Armand's own Antigone curtails the idea of a lineage, a vertical genealogical line, hope about the future, denying closure or resolution, even while offering a glimmer of relation in the wake of devastation. The bond of Creon with Aemon's corpse, supporting arms, carrying a body that is in the same horizontal position as the supporting ground, refashions the vertical relationality of reproductive hierarchy through what, referring to the death of Michael Brown, Stefano Arni and Fred Moten call a refusal of standing, of the posture that for them epitomizes modernity's socio-ecological disaster as constituted by the transatlantic slave trade, settler colonialism, and capital's emergence in and with the state. Sensually bonding with the blackness and silence beneath the lowest cavern is a means for thinking through the very possibility of extinction of a different world beyond and against extraction. It is a means of finding an atopic order of existence, in the words of Neum Chandler, an epistemic desedimentation, in his words, a disarticulation of conceptual and theoretical presumption. In his latest book on Du Bois, Chandler compares the coming about of this atopic order to the sharp and textured frisson of rock against rock, or to the ramblings of a small volcano, or the tremors of a barely tenable earthquake. The atopic, for Chandler, is the name of the project of immanent striving that will yield another world in the time to come. It is a way to think, in his words, beyond this narrow now, a phrase he draws from Du Bois's elegy for his son, another moment in which death becomes the only possibility for life, for non-succumbing to the cruel death of life as we know it. The atopic is a way to break new cognitive and political ground by inhabiting the possibility made palpable by the pandemic of an irremediable broken ground that no longer supports us. When we read in the last lines of Du Bois's elegy, "The wretched of my race that line the alleys of the nation sit fatherless and motherless," we think of Harman's Antigone and her dead child, of fatherless Antigone, or perhaps of an unmothered earth carrying a black child that is her own child, the child of the underlife, of the underground, joining the world of those above, leaving those of us who cling to the privilege of being called living humans with no ground beneath our feet. Thank you.
Wow. That was an extraordinarily rich paper, Mario. I'm going to open up the floor in a moment to questions, and I'm sure those questions will only touch the surface of the extraordinary depth of your forgive the pun, on the depth of the subterranean depth of what you've offered us. Tristan and I this year are going to start experimenting a little bit with the format and sort of maybe start beginning our question time by asking our speaker very briefly something, in fact, that you've already done, which is, if we're going to sort of think about the idea of critical antiquities, where do you think this paper sits in a kind of larger critical antiquities project as you conceive it?
Yeah, I would say that this paper and other recent work of mine seeks to explore the etymological and conceptual relation between critique and crisis, right? Of course, there is an obvious etymological connection between critique and crisis in the sense of judgment, but of course, we cannot, we can't avoid thinking of the other meaning of crisis, that is a kind of disruption of time. So for me, a critical approach to antiquity means not to solve a crisis, right? Which is what governments want to do in a situation of crisis by restricting possibilities, but actually it's a way to create a kind of rift in epistemic possibilities.
Okay, so in other words, to precipitate a crisis, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So like live in a kind of epistemic crisis. It is
Yeah.
a moment for, decentering, our assumptions about what antiquity is, and also for, experimenting with possibilities of reading, experimenting with encounters between antiquity and what we call the modern,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So
Yes. I in fact, many of us here in this Zoom room can recall the way that Tristan and I used to preface our workshops with a sort of a statement of what we thought critical antiquities was.
yeah,
And you seem to have saying something there which is very similar to what we believe too, which is that in the manifesto last year we expressed the idea of taking Karl Marx's notion of Veränderung and of change and of altering, and of using readings of Greco-Roman antiquity to intervene in the present in order to precipitate
right.
kind of an othering like that. I think a
I like
transformation.
I like the idea of intervening. Like we say, in scholarly language, we say this is an important intervention. But how many, and I don't want to be polemical, but how many books or articles in classics can be considered an intervention? That is to say, how many of them carry the sense of urgency or
Well,
of using scholarship as a way, to connect with a crisis that we are experiencing, for example, right?
this is the paradox that we in the academy face, isn't it? That the paradox between being an intellectual and not being an agent of praxis, right?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
I think that classicists, sort of have the tendency more than other scholars to think that what they do should not have an impact on the world that surrounds us, right? That in a sense, if you try to, make an intervention in the strong sense of the world, you are detaching yourself from what you're supposed to do, that is engaging with antiquity in a kind of reconstructive, in exclusively reconstructive mode of thinking. And of course, I'm not denying the importance of that reconstructive model and of certain forms of contextualism that are essential for our work. But I also think that it's really important, to recuperate this etymological connection that the Greek gives us between critique as judgment, but also as a stalling of judgment that is produced in a situation of disrupted time.
And can I just finally say, does this to some extent explain why your work gravitates towards comedy and tragedy in democratic Athens, in the sense that those two forms of performance were kind of constantly staged homeopathic crises, if you like, staged within within the democratic city, precisely in order to kind of keep the democratic critique active?
Yeah, so there is definitely that element. I mean, all the plays that we have were produced, you know, not all of them, but most of them during the Peloponnesian War, in a situation of war, of terrible crisis. So
Pandemic.
there is, right, and a pandemic as well. But in a sense, democracy is a crisis, always. Should be a situation of crisis. When, you know, democracy stops being a crisis, or when democratic crisis is addressed, you know, that's when we have to stop worrying. So in that respect, if it's true that Athenian drama is the expression or the quintessential expression of Athenian democracy, and when I'm saying that, I'm trying to deprive that of all the grandiosity of such statement. You know, if that's true, it's also an invitation for us to think about this text as a kind of aestheticization of crisis. And consequently, as an invitation to think about the connection between critique, literary criticism, obviously, criticism and crisis.
Look, I could hog this conversation with you for another hour or so, but it will be deeply unfair. I'm going to now turn over to the various letter queues that have been posted in the chat, which is our usual code for question. And Bob, it wouldn't be right without you being the first to have off the ring.
Thank you so much, Mario. That was absolutely wonderful. And
thank you.
And I mean, I think one of the things I loved most about it was that it just made me think of so many other parts of the play that you didn't have a chance to touch on. I mean, like the Ode to Man is this great bombastic statement of the Anthropocene, which is in tension with everything else. And Niobe in the Komos would speak to your lithic sensuality so well. But I did have a slightly more sort of confrontational question. The thing that kept coming to mind, talking about the earth so much in an Attic tragedy set in Thebes, it kept making me think of autochthony, and I just wondered about that, because I must admit I'm not a fan of the character Antigone. I'm much less sympathetic than most people seem to be these days, and throughout, of course, there is this tension between her grand appeals to the laws of the gods and the laws of Zeus and grand principles, and her very personal sort of pseudo-crypto-incestuous aristocratic obsession with burying her own brother. And I wondered whether is there a similar tension between this this embrace of the earth, or of the cosmic ecological mother Gaia that you again so beautifully unfolded, and a more sort of inward-looking obsession with our earth, with our land, with the land of Boeotia, from which the Spartoi, our ancestors, sprung.
That's a great question, actually, and it's true that I don't talk at all about autochthony in this paper, and in a sense, the argument I'm suggesting is a way to rematerialize the earth, you know, in opposition to a concept like autochthony that clearly, you know, practices ideologically the kind of a symbolic extractivism that I am talking about, right? I mean, as we know, the story of Athens, the myth that is behind, you know, the autochthony as we know it from Pericles in the funeral oration, it's a story of rape, obviously, right? The story. So autochthony is as an ominous and weird and even creepy element to it, which of course the Athenians completely transfigure and sublimate, right? Because in a sense it's all about life and about the fetishization of life, and not thinking about death at all, not thinking that the land, the earth that they are so obsessed with is also dust, right? So there is a kind of autoimmunitarian element to the ideology of autochthony which is completely erased, you know, in the Athenian propaganda, obviously, but that in a sense, you know, Antigone makes us feel, right? Because of course, her obsession with the land, with the earth, is so strongly enmeshed with death, and it is a way, as I try to suggest, to make some space for death, you know, in a discourse that tends to marginalize loss and death. So
wow. Also, ramifications kind of stretching off there. Thank you, Bob. Great question. Valentina.
Thank you. So my connection is a little unstable, so I hope it will work out. Thank you so much for the presentation, Mario. This was great. I just wanted to connect to what you were just saying. I think it's very productive to think of Antigone with Black indigenous thinkers, post-colonial, decolonial thinkers, precisely because of how death is constantly present, materially present in their thought. I think about when Hartman formulates, like when she discusses motherhood, there's always this claim, this idea that it is a constant thought of death, of the possibility of death, and the necessity to explain your own Black kids what that could mean every day. And of course, this transfers to necropolitics, which is so constantly, it makes every death political and a political topic. So I was wondering, in the Antigone, what do you do with her lamentation? Because I know you commented upon the lamentation, but there's a lot there that can be, that goes precisely in that direction, like how the body is recognized or not recognized. For instance, she compares herself to Niobe. She even compares herself to Hades' wife at some point. She claims she's Metoikos and she's staying with the dead. So all of this materiality and this supposed comparison that she makes with death or goddesses, what do you do with that? I'm interested. Thank you.
Right. So I'm not talking, you know, in this talk about mourning, which of course, you know, is a huge topic for Antigone studies. Of course, Julie Butler, and then Bonnie Oenig's obviously a response, you know, to Julie Butler. Niobe is something that I've actually been thinking about quite a bit. I've just finished editing a book on Niobe in critical theory. So in the case of, maybe I can speak a little bit about that. Niobe and Antigone are also paired. I mean, they're paired in that passage of Sophocles' Antigone, and Lacan cites Niobe in the Ethics of Psychoanalysis as an example of as an embodiment, as he puts it, of the Freudian death drive, as opposed to his own, you know, take on the death drive, which he connects with Antigone, right? So he establishes a kind of distinction between the Antigonian death drive and the Niobean death drive. But actually what you are suggesting is that, in a sense, you know, Lacan is disavowing, you know, the Freudian component of the Antigonian death drive, precisely because, you know, there is a kind of return to the earth, there is a return to the material, there is a kind of return to the rock in Antigone that makes her very similar to Niobe, and consequently makes the opposition between Freud's death drive and Lacan's death drive much less stark, or creates a dialogue between the two, in spite of Lacan's, very forceful attempt to differentiate himself and this notion of the death drive from Freud. So this is just to say that yes, there is a tendency perhaps to connect mourning with forms of Lacanian jouissance, right? And that jouissance should be, in a sense, reconceived in more material forms, and that's what I try to do here. But of course, I'm just scratching the surface. I'm sure that there is much more that can be done in this perspective.
I'm conscious that that we are sort of putting a lot of pressure on Mario in time-wise, but so we've got 2 more questions, and I think we will probably.
Oh no, it's only 6 p.m. here. I don't I don't like the American habit of having dinner very early, so I've remained quite Italian in that respect.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, well, look, well, we'll just move on to our next question, which is from James Collins.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, Mario. It's so good to see you again.
Nice. Yes, nice to hear your voice, James.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to go for the camera and then lose the connection altogether. But I hope this is not too basic a question, and it actually it sounded like the question in many ways that Bob wanted to ask at first, and then asked another. When you talk about the move from corpse to cave or to underground, in the time of crisis, in the violence of plague, as the chorus says, I wonder about how to track the chorus's care, how you track the chorus's care from beginning to end. Bob mentioned, of course, the Ode to Man, where we see sort of human power, not geopower. But by the end of the play, in one of the last stasima, their attention seems to be tracking celestial space, right? They say to Dionysus, watch over us. They track him sort of soaring over the mountains and identify him in their salvation from him as the leader in the dance of the stars. And so I wonder if the chorus is missing something important, if there's a reason for them to be sort of tracking things in by your account in the wrong direction, and if I understand correctly, do you see the chorus? Where do you see the chorus in this redirection of care from corpse to cave? Thanks.
Okay, so this is great. So you are suggesting that, in a sense, the chorus is moving the focus of the play back from the underworld to the upper world, of the gods, right?
Maybe, yeah.
Well, I mean, defining the position of the chorus in a tragedy, of course, is always very problematic. I mean, it seems that is the case. And I really like your reading. You can say that the chorus is, in a sense, trying to introduce an element of hierarchical reintegration or hierarchical closure, right? In a play that, on the other hand, through Antigone, at least as I see it, seems to invite us to linger, underneath, linger below. And that would be a typical tragic mechanism, right? There is always an element of closure. We can always see that in a play. There is always an attempt to reestablish hierarchy in some form, which of course connects with Aristotle's view of tragedy, of catharsis, and so forth, right? So And I've tried actually in another project to come to terms a bit with this idea. So the fact, and if this is true, the fact that this upper cosmology comes back and reaffirms itself still, for me, does not detract from the presence and importance in the previous part of the play of these moments, which, on the other hand, contest these focus, on the underworld. Because, of course, we have the tendency to read a play holistically, or to read it as a kind of developmental narrative. And in a sense, that's how Aristotle wants us to read it, or that's how we are trained to read it, through a linear narrative. But there can also be a kind of reading that actually focuses, that dwells, that lingers on specific moments, even in isolation from the developmental structure. So it's interesting that there is the tension between above and below that you're suggesting. But for me, the recomposition at the end does not diminish the importance of these more anti-hierarchical, more disruptive moments. I don't know whether I answered your question, but
you did. That's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you, Maria.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
Emma.
Hi, thank you. Mario, I love this work so much. Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions. I'll try and keep it quick because I know we're running out. I mean, I'm okay. It's 9 p.m., but that's early for me. Okay. I have a sort of more specific question, and then they're both fairly general questions. But I absolutely love this troping towards the ground and into the earth that you're doing, the sense of sort of intimacy and sinking down and making the connections between all of those tropes in Antigone and all of the work that's being done in Black studies that resonates with this. It's really beautiful and urgent. But I guess I have a couple of worries. One is that Antigone, there's no kinship in the ground. Like and then she uses that, which I was surprised I didn't hear you address, the question of metoikia, right? The at oddsness, where she says, I'm going to join my mother and father, but in this at odds distance from the oikos, or from any kind of uncomplicated sense of kinship. I mean, I guess because I'm thinking about Genos so much as a theme of life and what happens above the ground, that the idea of this kind of alt kinship going on under the ground is very challenging for me. And I just like to hear more on that. And then maybe on the philosophical plane, the separation of figure and ground in phenomenology, say, right? Can we have figure without an expulsion of a ground? What does it mean to bring figure and ground closer to one another on the phenomenological sense? I'm thinking about how Rainer Schurman figures this in Broken Hegemonies, where he draws on Beckett in Worsted Hoe, who says no ground but say ground.
But
say ground. But say ground, that somehow the articulation of ground is something that is a move that is going to always be made as soon as we make any kind of claim about anything, that there will be an excess of ground produced in that movement. So I guess that's the challenge, right? That in bringing this intimacy with the earth and with the ground, that somehow distinction is lost, or yeah. That's the first question. The second question is about crisis. And, I've been thinking a lot about this because my work has been about, introducing these tropes of chance and the aleatory into center stage. But I've become very nervous about this in the Trump years, the insurrection of January 6th and these kinds of unexpected incursions that aren't liberatory in any sense that we would desire, but are destabilizing and in profoundly reactionary ways. So I just wonder about crisis in general as a space that we might be a little more wary at this historical moment of valuing in an uncomplicated way.
Okay, great. These are all amazing questions. So I'll try to respond, as quickly as I can. So the underground and no kinship. So you suggest, yeah, I understand that there is no conventional kinship underground, but I mean, the kind of, I wouldn't call it kinship, but definitely, what I'm suggesting is a form of intimacy, that can be a replacement of kinship. In a sense, when Judith Butler talks about, kinship trouble in Antigone's claim, she is, thinking about Antigone as a possibility of reinventing kinship. And I guess what I'm doing is a more radical, I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm more radical than Judith Butler, please. Let me reframe, what I just said, because that sounds really horrible. I'm just saying it's a different take on kinship trouble. And if this kinship trouble turns in a kind of elimination of kinship and replacement of kinship with something more vague or something, less powerful, so be it, right? So, I mean, or again, it's not either or. I'm not trying to make an argument for these relations instead of kinship, but making a space for these other relationships on the edge, on the threshold between human and non-human, as a space for them in addition to traditional kinship, right? So I don't know whether I answered you, but I would not be as negative maybe as you are in saying that the underground is not a space for a construction of relationality. Maybe it's not kinship, but it's still a form of proximity with something. It's still a form of care that is predicated on a relationship.
Would you say it moves towards horizontality rather
Yeah,
than...
exactly. That's the metaphor. That's the image that I used, right?
Yes.
It's also a way of thinking of care, again, as mutual, again, as horizontal, as opposed to conventional models of care that always presuppose a relationship between subject and object, or at least it's often difficult to go beyond that model.
Thank you.
And then figuring ground, that is a great question. So are you also thinking of demand and figuring ground? When you were saying on figuring ground, I immediately thought of deconstruction for some reason, more than phenomenology.
Well, I was thinking of it as kind of the almost in the kind of Gestalt way, right? That for something to emerge, something has to recede, right? Yeah, that I mean, maybe demand has some, but that they're profoundly connected with one another. I mean, I think that's what a kind of radical reading of Heidegger.
Yeah, exactly.
That emergence and concealment are sort of co-constitutive with one another. But nonetheless, there's that movement of receding is coterminous with any movement of emergence, and I take this very, very seriously. So I just I was curious what
that is something I really want to think about more, but it's really crucial also because the kind of mode of reading that I suggest, in a sense, always implies the figurative. obviously.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so there is a kind of theoretical question that's more methodological or meta-methodological question that one has to deal with when you're making such a big claim, you know, and you're trying to make a case for the ground as such in a deeply material way, and then you're actually playing with all sorts of effective readings that rely on the figurative at multiple levels, right? So that's a very good challenge. As for the crisis, you know, the insurrection of January 6th, yes, that was horrible, obviously, and it was, but are we sure that even that was not a helpful moment in American life? That even that was not a crisis that sort of created an important aftermath? I mean, of course, it could have gone terribly awry. I concede that. But, you know,
I just worry about this language of disruptors and disruption that the right is so keen on right now. That
but it didn't disrupt anything. It was a sterile cul-de-sac, wasn't it?
but there's I guess a neoliberal sort of libertarian sort of it just seems very much in the water right now, this idea of kind of disruption as and it's profoundly capitalist. You know, how is it possible to carve out a kind of anti-capitalist or insurgent commitment to this underground?
But you don't think that democracy, in order to remain so, needs to have some moments, you know, of
it will. It has to.
disincorporation.
It's inherent, I think, in the democrat. You know, anyone who reads Plato knows this, right?
But in Plato, those moments of disruption, you know, they need to be addressed, and then they need to be almost eliminated.
Because democracy is already degraded for Plato.
It's a regime.
So you'd say that you know, the thinking about crisis as a mode of identification can turn into a kind of right-wing trope.
I think it just has. I think it just has in the last few years. So I just have some concerns about this right now. So I was curious to what you.
But also, you know, I mean, I'm sorry to be so so US centered, but don't you think that also having a Bernie Sanders figure, right, you know, creates a strong moment of disruption, you know, thinking about things that the US never thought about before, like healthcare for all, or, I mean, that was really a huge, and in fact, people in the liberal media did not want Bernie Sanders in any possible way, right? And considered that something that needed, you know, to be shut down quickly and immediately, which is what happened, you know, at a certain point.
No, absolutely, absolutely, and I've always thought this way, right? You know, that this kind of, you know, disruption from below is what needs to happen. But it's very strange that there's this been kind of appropriation of those discourses on the right, and I'm just not sure what to do with it. So yeah.
Well, let's move on to our penultimate question, which is from Diana.
Hi, Mario. Thank you for your paper.
Oh, thank you, Diana. Hi, nice to see you. Hi.
Nice to see you. I hope I didn't miss this part of the paper, and I hope what I'm saying is not too much of a stretch. But when you talk about ground and Antigone, I think about Akuba rolling on the ground, sleeping on the ground in Euripides' Trojan Women. And yes. I wonder how, like, your mode of reading could be applied there, because after all, there too we have a moment of collapse of a city that kind of seems like the collapse of the world, right? Akupa is deprived of all her kinship relations because she remains alone and she's degrading into slavery. So I wonder, like, if we can read something in that scene too,
No, I
like
think that
starting from your
sure.
perspective.
That's a great connection that you are establishing between Antigone and the beginning of Trojan Women, because in that case, she's almost the ground, right? Of course, reconstructing the staging is always problematic, but it's pretty clear, or sort of clear from the text, that she is, stretched out on the ground, and that you don't even see her face, or initially, that she raises her face only after the prologue with Poseidon and Athena, but most reconstructions, of that scene actually suggest that she's on stage already when the two gods, are talking. So in a sense, she hides, behind her clothes or in her clothes, and she blends. I would say she blends with the ground.
Blends with the ground.
She becomes a
Yes.
kind of second ground, and then when she starts talking, of course, she rises, and so you can also see the movement of the play as an abandonment of that position of being the ground. That's actually quite interesting. That in a sense, tragedy, flirts with the idea of being the ground or inhabiting that space, but ultimately has to abandon it, because that kind of inaction that being the ground produces would prevent tragedy from happening.
Yes.
Right? So you are actually suggesting that there is this constant tension between inactivity, pure inactivity, and on the other hand, setting the play in motion and so forth. And of course, you can see this tension also as a tension between two different kinds of political agency, if you like.
Yes. I mean, you said much more than I was thinking, but yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, look, I did have another question, but I think we've taxed your time too much, Mario. And
no, it was a pleasure.
It's almost 2 hours that you've been working for us. So,
with pleasure, anytime.
So let's thank Mario again for a superb, provocative
Thank
paper.
you.
Much to think about. I couldn't get Achilles rolling around in the dust in Iliad 18 out of my head.
Sure.
But it's superb stuff. And is this piece going to appear soon in some?
Yes, it's part of my pandemic book, which should be out in a month.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a quick turnaround from seminar paper to.
Well, I did write it, during the pandemic,
Okay.
So because I never left the house during the pandemic, as Emma knows, my partner and I remained inside, literally inside for 1.5 years without ever leaving. And the most weird thing is that we actually enjoy it.
That's the dangerous thing, isn't it, about the pandemic, is that we all secretly actually enjoyed it.
So that's what I did during the pandemic. I just try to think about tragedy in light of the pandemic.
Wonderful. All right, thanks again, Mario.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope we will meet in person one day.
Well, we'll try and find a way to bring you out to down under from Antigone to Antiquities, right?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tristan. Thank you again for the great introduction. Bye-bye. Thank you all.
See you later.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.